Rain tapped steadily on the windshield of the old silver gray Ford as Harlan Rowe turned into the gravel parking lot of Marlin's Table. Branch number 42, Bramblewood. The rain wasn't heavy, but just enough to make people duck their heads when stepping out of their cars. Harlan didn't rush. He sat still, letting the rhythmic patter of rain on the metal roof soothe the thoughts churning in his mind. Outside, small groups of people quietly made their way into the diner. Workers, truck drivers, retirees, each moving as if out of routine, not because they expected a memorable experience. Harlan adjusted the frayed brim of his baseball cap, put on foggy plastic-rimmed glasses, and pulled the collar of his flannel shirt high to hide most of his salt and pepper beard. His appearance was a carefully calculated disguise, too plain to draw attention, too much a part of Bramblewood to raise suspicion. No one knew the man who stepped out of that faded car had once been the strategic mind behind dozens of M&A deals in the food service industry, and even fewer knew that he was the one who had drawn up the original market distribution map for Marlin Hill Hospitality more than 20 years ago. Starting from this very small town, Bramblewood, the name used to stir in him a strange sense of pride. Back then, his father, Joseph Rowe, had said that if they could build a branch that truly lived in a place like Bramblewood, then they could build one anywhere. And he was right. Marlin's Table had once been a true morning stop, a place where people didn't just eat breakfast, but began their day with a smile from the staff and a cup of coffee poured with both hands. But this morning, the sign Marlin's Table under the awning was lit only by a few dim, flickering bulbs. The glass door was streaked with rain and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in days. Inside, the lighting was dull yellow, and the background music leaking from the ceiling speaker sounded like it had been dragged from a radio station decades ago. Harlan stepped in, and no one looked up. A girl with dyed blonde hair, barely 20, was typing on her phone behind the counter. She wore an oversized uniform, her name tag crooked, reading Tori. Without looking up, she spoke like a machine on autopilot. One person? Pick any open table. No greeting, no eye contact, no smile. Harlan nodded slightly, keeping the southern drawl he had practiced back in his hotel room. Yes, ma'am. Then he turned, quietly picking a seat, a small table in the corner, right next to the men's restroom, beside a mop and a rack of spare hand towels. He wasn't surprised. That spot in any diner was always silently reserved for solo customers, the elderly, or those considered not worth noticing, like how trash gets pushed into a corner, discreet but unmissed. Harlan took off his glasses, gently wiped off the rain, and opened a worn leather notebook from his coat pocket, something he always carried, like an envelope of memories. Inside, he marked the line he had written the night before. Service condition, first point of contact. Below it was a scribbled note in blue ink. Observe morning shift start, when true nature of operations leaks through most clearly. Harlan scanned the room. A service station stood in the center, where two male employees leaned against the coffee machine, chatting quietly enough to laugh without disturbing customers. A tilted Employee of the Month plaque hung near the kitchen entrance, still bearing someone's name from June, even though today was late October. The layout hadn't changed in over a decade, but the feeling had. Instead of the vibrant warmth he remembered, the place wore an invisible layer of dust, present in the empty stares of the guests, the sluggish steps of the staff, and the soft clinks of cutlery as if no one really wanted to stay another minute. Tori brought the menu over and dropped it on the table without looking at him. Here's the breakfast menu. Harlan nodded, saying nothing more. In the role of Hank, a retired truck driver, he had no right to ask for anything beyond black coffee and invisibility. But inside, a question had already begun to take shape. What turns a place once defined by care into a transit station of indifference? Harlan had always believed that corporate culture could be transmitted through a system, like electricity through copper wires, provided the standards were right, the procedures precise, and the leadership understood the mission. But here, something had broken the circuit, and he was about to find it, not through authority, but through silence. The coffee was brought out by a small pair of hands, quick but not rushed. Not from Tori, and not from the two young men still giggling by the counter. It came from a petite girl with her hair neatly tied back with a faded silver scrunchie, wearing an old but clean and crisply ironed uniform. Her face was slightly flushed from running tables too long in the muggy air, but her eyes held a steady gaze, neither evasive nor tired. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft and even, not overly cheerful, not cold, just enough for a stranger like Harlan to feel seen. "Black as midnight, right?" he replied, nodding gently. She let out a small laugh, a short but genuine one. "Yes, classic choice for cross-state truckers." And just like that, she poured the coffee, not spilling a single drop, then walked away, carrying a tray with a check and 3 glasses of water for the table next to his. Harlan watched her, slowly turning the cup in his hand. Her steps were steady without any wasted motion. A well-trained employee? Perhaps. But to Harlan, he had met this type before. The kind of person shaped by pressure, but who still chose to walk upright. Someone who understood that falling down was the easiest thing to do, and so chose the harder path. He observed her for the next 10 minutes. All the large tables, from the group of shift workers to the 2 old men arguing over baseball scores, were funneled into her section. Any customers showing signs of being difficult, fussy, or needing extra help were all seated in her care. Meanwhile, the 2 young men, Kyle and Mason, remained by the counter, talking about TikTok, laughing loudly when a young woman in a short skirt walked in, and they competed to serve her. Harlan leaned over to grab a napkin and gently dabbed the bit of coffee that had spilled beside his saucer. His eyes never left the movement across the dining area. June, he caught her name from the loosely worn name tag, never stopped moving. 3 tables, then 4, then 5. An elderly woman with a sore leg struggled by the restroom door. She was the first to notice, quickly rushing over to assist, offering a steady hand without saying much, just a nod, before returning to fulfill 3 still pending orders. From afar, Kyle glanced her way and smirked. "She's good, I'll give her that. Too bad all that talent's wasted without a face that earns tips." Harlan pretended not to hear, but the words stung, not because of what was said, but because of the story behind it. A story he had once believed was long gone from the Marlin's table system. The story of tip tracking, a practice where the POS system would automatically split tips based on shift activity, but could be manipulated if someone held the login rights. Harlan had personally rewritten the company's tip distribution protocols to eliminate that loophole. But what he saw here was a throwback to the old system, where appearances and favorability dictated who earned more, regardless of fairness or effort. An older customer, with silver hair and a still warm cup of coffee, shook slightly and dropped his mug right in the middle of the dining area. People flinched, liquid splashing onto the floor, shards scattering near Harlan's table. Kyle, the closest, turned, glanced at the old man, then sneered. "You tipping or just wasting our time?" He didn't say it loudly, but it was enough for those nearby to hear. Enough for the old man's face to freeze, then drop as he bent over and quietly wiped his hands with a napkin, like he'd done something wrong. Harlan didn't move. Part of him wanted to get up, walk over, and call out the smug 20-something on the spot. But another part, the one seasoned by years of internal audits and silent observations, kept him seated. Not out of fear, but because he knew that if you wanted to change something, you had to understand it completely first. A knee-jerk reaction might relieve anger, but it wouldn't uproot the cause. The girl named June stepped up from behind, crouched and picked up each shard of porcelain. She gently said to the old man, "I'm sorry you had to do that, sir. Next time, just call me, okay?" No blame, no rush, no performance. She bowed slightly and set a fresh cup of coffee on his table. "This one's on me." And then she walked away, not needing any praise. Harlan opened his notebook and wrote a short line under that morning's heading. June Alvarez carrying the entire restaurant. No one notices. Below that, he added another line in smaller handwriting. You can tell, if Marlin's table still has anything worth believing in, it's in the soles of her worn-out shoes. The smell of coffee in the diner had begun to soak into the worn fabric of Harlan's coat. Not in the pleasant way it used to in his memories, but more like a faint stain of something not quite right. Each dark sip should have brought clarity, but here it only weighed his heart down, bit by bit. The girl named June kept moving, pouring coffee, clearing plates, taking orders. But every time a customer paid by card, he saw the same pattern play out. Kyle or Mason would suddenly appear, wedging themselves between June and the customer just as they reached for their wallets. "We got it, sir, ma'am." Then quickly handling the transaction at the POS terminal stationed near the central counter. The card reader wasn't located in the service area. It was fixed to the counter, guarded by those two alone. Harlan observed for nearly 30 minutes. Not once did June touch that machine. Her customers, mostly elderly, families or workers in a rush, often paid in cash, and some used cards, but the ones who processed the payments were always Kyle or Mason. After each transaction, they would hurriedly stuff the receipts into a drawer or wave their hand with a casual, "All set, ma'am," never offering a customer copy. Harlan made notes. He didn't need a data breakdown to see it. A system had been designed to cut June out of every stream of digital tips. He raised his hand for a refill. June returned, still wearing a tired but unforced smile. "Want a top-up, sir?" she asked, already holding the glass carafe. "Yeah, give this old man another sip of bitter black to keep him from dozing off," Harlan joked, keeping his practiced southern drawl. She poured, one hand steadying the carafe, the other gently lowering the cup. As the coffee reached the brim, he said softly, almost offhandedly, "How long have you worked here?" June froze, just for a second. Her eyes flickered, as if she'd just seen something she hadn't prepared to hide. She glanced around, then replied in a low voice, "Almost 3 years." Harlan nodded, absent-mindedly turning the metal spoon in his cup. "So you probably know every nook and cranny of this place by now, huh?" She didn't smile this time. "They call it a split shift, but who gets the split and who gets the shift, you figure it out." Her voice was flat, but her eyes told a different story, quiet, guarded, and wary. Harlan said no more. He simply reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a clean napkin, and pretended to wipe his hands before placing it deliberately on the table. A subtle signal. She saw it, glanced at it, then bent down and, from her apron pocket, pulled out a quarter-folded slip of paper, tucking it beneath the untouched plate of toast in front of him. Harlan waited for her to walk away before unfolding it. A handwritten list in blue ink, detailing over 20 transactions. Table 6, $7 tip. October 3rd, Table 12, $10 tip, 10/7. Table 9, $5 tip, 10/11. The final line read, total, $136. Received, $18. Cash. No explanation, just numbers. But to Harlan, it was the clearest indictment he'd seen. He folded the paper and tucked it into his worn leather notebook. His heartbeat slowed, not from the amount of money, but from the silence wrapped around it. The silence a young woman had learned to live with, had written out in numbers, as if to remind herself, "I'm not making this up." Harlan had heard every excuse during internal audits. Oversight, staffing gaps, the new process hasn't been implemented yet. But papers like this, these didn't show up in audit reports. They were living proof of something more insidious, a culture of neglect, a system that didn't need to scream to create injustice. It only had to look away. Kyle walked past Harlan's table, slamming a stack of receipts on the counter, then turned to Mason and said, "Bet we hit 100 already today, man. Digital tips are freaking gold." Harlan took another sip of coffee. This time, it truly tasted bitter. The wooden wall clock gave 3 soft, even chimes, signaling that the morning shift was nearly halfway through. Harlan was still in the same seat, now with a third full cup of coffee and a plate of toast gone cold. He hadn't eaten, not because of the food, but because a heaviness had begun to settle in his chest. On a page in his leather notebook, he flipped back through old notes, records once listing branches requiring post-COVID cultural reassessment. Bramblewood, oddly enough, had never been on that list. On paper, this location had never reported any violations. Stable staffing levels, low refund rates, few customer complaints. But now, with every observation, every word from June, and every smirk from Kyle, he knew. The most dangerous virus wasn't outside the system. It was in its bloodstream. Harlan stood. He needed to check the restroom. a common excuse to assess areas people rarely paid attention to. But this time, he didn't go in. Instead, he stopped in front of the shift schedule board posted behind the service hallway, visible only to staff. It was an old whiteboard, its frame lightly rusted, with paper printouts listing daily assignments for the week. Across the top, faint pencil scrawls crisscrossed in layers, erased and rewritten many times. Harlan leaned in close, squinting to read each line. What hit him wasn't the schedule. It was a deliberate operational pattern. The name June had been written, crossed out, written again, then replaced with support, not front, repeatedly, for days, weeks, as if someone had intentionally written it, erased it, not from error, but to send a message. Harlan didn't touch the board, but his fist clenched, the knuckles visible beneath his sleeve. To an outsider, this might look like flexible scheduling, but to him, a man who once sat in the executive rooms that drafted the entire Marlin Hill operating system in 2009, this was a form of soft violence, executed in pencil, wordless, without a summons, just the system's way of stripping a name from a core role, making the person behind it feel like a spare part, temporary, disposable, erasable. Harlan remembered a meeting years ago when he himself had said, anyone listed on the frontline roster must be protected like the face of the brand. But now on the shift board of Branch 42, a name was being worn down by public disregard. Back at his table, Harlan saw June cleaning table 3, where a young family had just left. He waited until she returned for the tray, then asked gently, without pity, without drama, why don't you transfer to another branch? With your skills, any place would be lucky to have you. She paused, turned to him, and her eyes didn't show surprise. They showed the familiarity of someone who'd heard this question many times before. Because I don't have another name at another place, she replied. No smile, no sigh. Here, at least I'm still someone. The words weren't loud, but they echoed like chimes in Harlan's mind. No one at corporate ever thought that a name could be the only thing keeping someone anchored inside a coal system. No one imagined that being renamed on a shift board from a core staff member to support could make a person start to believe they didn't belong. But Harlan understood, because he was the one who had written those rosters, the one who had once ordered label changes for easier data tracking, the one who thought separating primary from support was logical. And now here he was, sitting inside the very model he helped create, listening to a young woman say she had no name left, except the one that got crossed out week after week. His hand lightly brushed the edge of the table. There was a small scratch on the left corner near the glass wall. He leaned forward, ran his fingertip gently across the thin layer of dust. Beneath it, a faint etching made with a key, old but still legible, 1997, HR. Harlan closed his eyes for a moment. That was the year he and his father came to Bramblewood, when the diner was still a converted wooden house, and he was just a young man who never imagined he'd one day become a CEO. He had carved that line after finishing the first development blueprint as a kind of marker. He never thought that nearly 30 years later, he'd return, not to feel proud, but to watch his own legacy turn its back on the good people within it. That scratch, it was a metaphor. A man who once built the system, now quietly realizing that if left unchecked, that very system could erase even its own maker. Harlan said nothing more, but he opened his notebook and drew a red line straight through the checklist item labeled Stable Branch. Beneath it he wrote, I once laid the foundation for this place, but she's the one keeping it alive. Around 10 a.m., the frosted glass door behind the front counter swung open. Harlan was slowly stirring his fourth cup of coffee when he heard the faint squeak of the hinge. A small sound, but one that shifted the atmosphere in the diner ever so slightly. The man who stepped out appeared to be in his 40s. Slicked back hair, polished leather shoes, a crisply ironed white shirt, and a light gray tie. Not a staff uniform, but clearly someone in a position of power. Harlan didn't need to ask his name. He had seen this man in the files. Darren Beckett, Central Region Manager, directly overseeing 3 branches in the chain, including Bramblewood. Darren walked straight over to Kyle and Mason, shaking both their hands with the ease of someone greeting trusted pillars of the team. The three of them laughed heartily, chatting about something Harlan couldn't quite hear, but he saw June's eyes as she returned from table 4. Not jealous, not angry, just the resigned gaze of someone who had long since learned that certain laughter wasn't meant for them. Darren looked at June for a long moment. His stare wasn't loud, wasn't overtly offensive, but it carried a clear message. We control you, and you know it. Harlan flipped open his notebook and quietly marked a small triangle, his private symbol for internal manipulation environment. This wasn't just about abuse of authority, but about the symbiosis between overseers and the beneficiaries of an exploitative system. Kyle and Mason, with their self-assured grins, weren't just lazy employees. They were protected assets of management, the links that let everything slip past the reports without leaving a trace. Harlan stood, stretched a little, then casually walked toward the payment counter, where a stack of pre-printed receipts sat. He pretended to drop a wooden toothpick on the counter, bent down to pick it up, and let a small stack of papers fall with it. As he gathered them, he slipped an extra sheet into his hand, an A4 paper mixed in with the receipts. A confidential internal staff classification sheet. It bore no stamps, no author name, just a simple table with 2 columns. Primary operator and support to non-primary. Kyle and Mason's names were bolded in the primary column. June's name appeared 3 times under the secondary column, marked with an S and a small note. No POS access. Cash only. Harlan gave the paper a slight squeeze, folded it, and tucked it into his leather notebook. His eyes found June, now attending to a special table, a grandmother and her granddaughter, about 6 or 7 years old, both wearing thin raincoats, their hair still damp. The grandmother hunched and moved slowly, while the girl was bright-eyed and energetic. June knelt on one knee beside the table to speak with the child, as patient as if she didn't have 10 other tables waiting. She handed the menu to the girl, then pulled a small box of crayons from her apron, clearly something she brought herself, and whispered, "You pick something, then color this picture. I'll print you another one to take home, okay?" The little girl squealed with joy, her eyes lighting up. The grandmother smiled too, her expression softening after the rain. Harlan didn't look away. This was what had once made him believe in the service industry. Listening without a recording device, caring without chasing a KPI. But just moments later, the kitchen door swung open again. A kitchen staff member poked his head out and called loudly, "June, come in for a sec." She turned to glance at Harlan, then quietly made her way to the kitchen. Less than 2 minutes later, she returned, expressionless. Her hands didn't tremble, but something had changed. The smile was gone. No more gentle eye contact when leaning in toward a guest. No more soft questions for the elderly about water refills. No more instinctive hand reaching to wipe table corners without being asked. Harlan saw it. He recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had just received a silent warning. A disciplinary tactic no one witnessed, no one recorded, but more destructive than any formal write-up. Darren stepped back out from behind the counter, no longer smiling. He simply stood there scanning the restaurant like a man surveying his territory. Kyle whispered to Mason, "Damn, girl's got nerves of steel. Still won't crack a smile, huh?" This time, Harlan didn't write anything in his notebook. He simply let out a long breath, as if testing how much of what he once believed he could control was now slipping out of reach. The elderly woman at table 6 had just gotten up when her granddaughter tugged her hand, pointing at June as she bent over to wipe a table. "Grandma, is that lady the owner?" "Why do you ask, sweetie?" "Because she acts like the owners I see on TV. She's always there. She takes care of everybody." Harlan smiled, a smile that wasn't warm, wasn't amused. It was a smile that cut like a dull blade. He stood, adjusted his coat. Before heading back to his seat, he paused at the counter and placed down an unused receipt. On the back, in bold blue ink, he wrote one line. "The truth doesn't live in reports. It lives in how someone is forced to stay silent under the gaze of power." It wasn't clear when the rain had stopped. Outside, sunlight filtered through thin layers of cloud, casting a quiet light over the puddled parking lot. But inside Marlin's table, branch 42, The atmosphere had never felt colder. Harlan could sense a shift in the rhythm of the diner's operation. The clinking of spoons against cups had lost its pattern. New customers still came in, but the gazes in the room seemed to deliberately avoid meeting one another. Darren continued pacing slowly across the dining area, making calls while glancing down each row of tables. Kyle and Mason now spoke in hushed tones, like they'd just been told, "Don't give it away." And June kept working, but it was no longer the same June from that morning. Her smile had drained. Her back no longer held straight. Her steps had slowed by half a beat, something so subtle, but to Harland, it was a red alert. He decided not to wait any longer. It was time for a test. When June arrived at his table with a handwritten bill, Harlan gently slid his credit card toward her. "Charge it for me, please," he said. She nodded and reached out automatically, but before her hand touched the POS, Kyle appeared out of nowhere like magic. "Let me help you with that," he said, already snatching the card, not bothering to ask. A deliberate brush of his fingers against hers. Then he turned, grinning at Mason as if scoring a point. Harlan said nothing. He just added, deliberately louder than before, "Make the tip $50, will you?" June earned it. Kyle turned back, flashed a thumbs up, smiling like a second-rate actor. "Absolutely, boss." And just like that, he processed the charge at lightning speed on the POS. No customer confirmation, no printed receipt, no visible total. Harlan nodded, swallowing his anger. Exactly as he had expected. June returned less than a minute later. She carried nothing. "Thank you, sir. Have a nice day," she said, with the same gentle voice, but now stripped of belief. Harlan smiled, nodded, but before he left, he set down his empty glass of water, and beneath it, face down, a $1 coin. Under the glass, written in bold blue ink, were the words, "How much has been stolen?" Then he stood. His pace was slow, unrushed, like just another old man who had finished his coffee and needed to reach his car before the rain came back. He didn't look back, but he knew someone would read that line. And if that someone was the same girl he had been watching all morning, then she would not take it as a joke. As Harlan passed the coffee station, an elderly woman slowly stepped back to make way for him. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. She leaned slightly, covering her mouth to whisper, as if carried by the wind. "June caught me when I slipped last year. Right over there." She pointed to the tiled floor near the restrooms. "They made her scrub the whole day, said she disrupted procedure. They're not worthy." Harlan halted for just a second. He didn't nod, didn't reply, just tilted his head slightly, a silent thank you. The old woman walked off, and he continued toward the door. For the first time in years, Harlan felt a silence within himself, the kind that arises when one sees their own mistake and realizes there's no one else to blame. 3 minutes after he left the diner, June came to clear his table. She saw the coin, saw the message. For 2 seconds, she froze. Then, as if on instinct, she bent down, picked up the glass, and quickly dried the note beneath it. Her eyes scanned the room. Then she opened her apron's pocket, pulled out a handwritten receipt. This time not an order, but a record. She folded it small, placed it in the glass, and walked straight outside, where there were no cameras. Harlan was already standing by his car, leaning against the warm hood. She approached, didn't meet his eyes, just handed him the glass of water. "Looks like you forgot this," she said. He took it, didn't open it. She still didn't look up. "I know that's not a joke," she added, then turned and walked away. No job plea, no complaint, no cry for help, and no need for him to say a word. Only once, back inside his car, door closed, did Harlan unfold the paper. A single line in firm black ink read, $637.29. Just this month. I count. They delete. Below it were 3 underlined symbols, the very ones Harlan himself had created for the digital tip distribution schema in 2015. No ordinary employee would know how to encode that. She wasn't just tracking. She understood the system better than those running it, and someone had gone out of their way to bury her. Harlan exhaled, a breath that didn't meet the air, but sank deep into himself, into the part of him that now understood. The game had begun. The old Ford had rolled out of the gravel lot, but Harlan hadn't gone far. He parked along a small road behind the store, where no one paid attention. Just a few dumpsters and a rusted sign pointing to the old delivery zone. He rolled down the window, turned off the engine, and sat still. His eyes weren't on the road, nor on the dashboard, but fixed on the plastic water cup on the passenger seat, where June's folded note still rested neatly. He reread the words again, as if needing to hear them echo in his mind. $637.29. Just this month. I count. They delete. No extra words, no complaints. But to Harlan, it was the most honest report he had ever received in his entire career. No filters, no edits, no spin. Just the raw numbers of truth, buried beneath the very procedures he had helped design. He opened his notebook. The leather had darkened to a deep brown, the stitching frayed along the edges. But it was still sturdy, just like when he first bought it, used for field visits where no one knew who he was. The center page, where he often tucked loose documents, had loosened, and an old photograph slipped into his lap. He picked it up and held it for a while. A picture from the summer of 1998. Him standing beside his father, both wearing Marlins Table baseball caps, hands resting on a newly erected wooden sign. The colors had faded, but the words at the bottom were still clear. Built on honesty, served with dignity. Harlan closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the seat. His memory returned him to that moment, when his father was still strong, still looked into the sunlight and said, "One day people may not remember our names, but if they remember what it felt like to be served with decency, that's enough." And yet, Harlan had forgotten where that feeling lived. All these years he had talked about system transformation, data governance, quarterly growth, but never once returned to check if the heart of that system still beat. And now a girl whose name had been erased from the schedule had reminded him who he used to be. He unlocked his phone, made a call quickly. On the other end, someone picked up after 2 rings. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low, but sharp like an unmissable command. "Yes, sir, I'm here. I need the POS logs from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. today. Branch 42, Bramblewood. Include all camera footage from the payment station, kitchen, and main floor." "Yes, sir. Where should I send it?" "To me. Director. Encrypted channel. Include the current staff classification, POS access roles, shift logs, and this month's assignment roster." A brief silence followed. Then Jasmine asked, not out of doubt, but in quiet astonishment, "Sir, where are you calling from?" Harlan looked out his window, where the weak sunlight was catching on an old scratch in the glass, like a faint crack between generations. He answered slowly, each word like a nail driven into wood. "From the very place I once forgot my own name." There were no further questions. Jasmine understood. When Harlan used that voice, no one, not even the board, was allowed to interfere with what came next. And what was coming next was not just a system audit. It was a redefinition of the company's core values. Harlan ended the call. He didn't start the car. There was no rush. Because this time, he wasn't acting as a CEO. He was acting as a father, looking back at the place once called his firstborn, and realizing he had let it fall into the hands of those who turned kindness into a tool for exploitation. He opened the trunk and retrieved a sealed envelope. Inside was a scanned document from 2001, detailing the frontline worker priority principle. And he knew, the thing most often forgotten in any system wasn't data, it was people. And when people are erased with pencil from the very blueprint where they were once promised a place, that is no longer management. That is betrayal. Friday morning, 7:55 a.m. The sky over Bramblewood wasn't raining, but heavy with clouds, as if the whole town was holding its breath. In front of Marlin's Table, Branch 42, a black SUV pulled in, gliding like smoke. No screeching brakes, no slamming doors. But its presence struck the atmosphere like thunder in a sealed room. The car door opened. A man stepped out. Charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, polished Oxford shoes with not a speck of dust. No hat, no glasses, no bulky overcoat. His face was sharp, exposed. His eyes, quiet blades. Harlan Rowe. He didn't look around, didn't smile, didn't clear his throat. He simply pushed the door open and walked in. step by step, as if the floor beneath him were the control panel to the entire destiny of this place. The beeping of the POS machine, the clinking of spoons, Kyle teasing Mason, all stopped in under 3 seconds. No one knew who he was. No one had time to ask, because Harlan, standing still in the center of the dining floor, spoke, not shouting, no mic, no raised voice. Yet everyone heard, "I'm Harlan Rowe, and today we're cleaning this place out." A free fall. Kyle froze, still clutching the POS device. Mason stepped back, eyes locked on the collar of Harlan's shirt, as if awaiting confirmation that this couldn't be real. Darren, stepping out of the office, phone still to his ear, froze mid-step, like someone struck by lightning. He snapped, half yelling, half fumbling for control. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Who gave you the right—" Harlan didn't turn to him. He just spoke, not even bothering to make eye contact. "I'm the one who wrote the rules you've been trampling on every day." Silence. A server, one working table 3, mumbled to the person next to him. "That's the name etched on the meeting room wall upstairs. He's that HR." Another staff member, a line cook, set down a half-held spatula and stepped forward, offering a slight bow. Harlan didn't need to knock, didn't need to repeat himself, but Jasmine, his executive assistant, had already arrived, following him through the door. In her arms, a red folder, 2 encrypted hard drives, and a compact projector. She placed the projector on the central table, opened her laptop, no preamble necessary. The POS camera feed flashed on the large screen, showing clear footage of Kyle handling nearly every card payment, while June stood aside, watching, then stepping back. No narration needed. Everything was painfully clear. Jasmine pointed to a printout. Since July, 73 card transactions were processed by Kyle instead of June. 92% of those included digital tips. Total funds that never reached the real server, $1,829. Darren Beckett signed off on all staff assignments. But, she clicked to the next slide, 4 receipts show altered customer signatures replaced by Mason. The room held its breath. Darren began, "I wasn't aware of any of this. I will—" Harlan raised his hand, for the first time today, cutting someone off. "No need to act, sir. Every single dollar was funneled into an LLC named North Elm Partners, formed 3 weeks after you were promoted to regional manager." Darren fell silent. No one dared move. Kyle suddenly dropped the POS device and made for the door. But 2 plainclothes men stepped inside, calm but firm. No handcuffs, no shouting, but their eyes said it all. Someone wasn't walking out of here today. Harlan scanned the room. For the first time, he looked for June. She was behind the counter. He didn't know when she got there, hands resting on the surface, eyes wide. Not pale, not confused, but a kind of stunned pain of being vindicated far too late. He nodded gently, then turned to address everyone. "We've let this system run itself for far too long, and it has operated like a pilotless train, rolling right over the people who kept it alive. I apologize for that, but starting today, this ends." No applause. No one shouted hallelujah, but in everyone's eyes there was something new. A light reignited, not with slogans, but with action. The atmosphere after the reveal wasn't as loud as people might imagine. No one slammed the tables. No one rushed to call the press. Not a single person even left their seat. As if everyone instinctively understood that after today, everything old and familiar about this restaurant would be gone. Darren Beckett, Kyle, and Mason, none of them reacted violently. They couldn't. The evidence was too clear. The internal investigation began immediately, right there, in front of the entire staff. Jasmine moved swiftly, bringing up POS footage 1 clip at a time, pointing out every stolen tip that never made it to the actual server, every forged signature, every internal role classification that had been altered through data manipulation. No one shouted, but the evidence was so undeniable that anyone who tried to reject it would have to reject their own eyes. Harlan didn't look at the ones being removed. He focused on those who remained, the long-timers, the silent workers, the ones who had bowed their heads when their shifts were changed, hours cut, or POS access revoked without a single word of explanation. Now they watched him, not with hope, but with the gaze of those who had long since stopped believing in justice, and were now being shown they were wrong. He gave a signal. A technician stepped forward with a nameplate, freshly printed but sharp. Harlan took it with his own hands and walked it over to June, right in the center of the dining floor, the very space she had carried on her back without ever being mentioned in a single management meeting. Assistant General Manager, June Alvarez. He didn't read it out loud. There was no trophy. He simply looked into her eyes and said, "We're not just apologizing, we're correcting." Then he handed her two envelopes. One, a statement of the recovered digital tips, $1,829, approved and to be wired before the day's end. The other, a full scholarship from the Marlin Hill Development Fund, covering her entire tuition for a finance degree at Bramblewood Community College, including books and materials. June stood still. No tears, no trembling. But her fingers clenched the edge of the envelope, as if holding on to something she feared might slip away. Harlan didn't need her to say anything. Her eyes had said enough. "June," he added, this time softer, just for her to hear, "your name won't be written in pencil anymore." One employee stood, a man who had cleaned the kitchen for over 15 years, and clapped. Then another, and another, not thunderous, not chaotic, just hands once calloused by pans and grills, now raised in thanks. Harlan bowed his head slightly to the room. Not like a boss, but like someone who had just been forgiven. A few hours later, the door opened again. A familiar elderly woman stepped inside, holding an umbrella, followed by a little girl in a pink coat, skipping across the tile. June stepped forward, still in uniform, still wearing the nameplate she hadn't yet gotten used to. She knelt slightly. "Welcome back, you two." The girl looked at her for a moment, then asked, just like last time, "Are you the owner now?" June paused for a second. Then she smiled. A smile no longer weighed down, no longer hidden behind a hot coffee pot. "I don't have to be the owner to do what's right." Harlan stood off in the distance, not stepping forward. He watched the scene like looking into a future that should have arrived much sooner. And for the first time in many years, he felt at peace to step back from the spotlight. One short sentence, but enough to turn Bramblewood into a place where every employee, whether quietly working behind the scenes or leading from the front, could feel their own worth. Here, people no longer worked just for a paycheck. They worked because they understood they were part of something bigger. That day, June, the newly promoted manager, entrusted directly by Harlan with the opportunity to lead change, sat inside the diner as the afternoon sun began to fall. A gentle stream of light filtered through the window, casting a soft glow across the beverage station. Everyone continued their tasks as usual, but the air in the restaurant had shifted. Gone were the uncertain glances. Gone was the fear of being reprimanded. She looked out the window where an elderly man sat quietly nearby, the same one she had seen during her very first days here. It was Harlan. But today he was no longer the head of anything, no longer the one in charge. He was just a regular customer, sipping his coffee in peace. June smiled when she saw him. A warmth filled her chest. After all the years of labor and witnessing change, she knew now that everything had happened for a reason. Harlan hadn't just changed the diner. He had changed her. He had shown her that true leadership begins with humility and with respect for others. She walked over to his table and gently asked, "I brew it strong these days. Think you can handle it?" Harlan looked up, a soft smile forming on his face. He didn't answer right away. He simply set his cup down on the table, then gazed out the window. The golden light of early evening bathed the room in quiet stillness. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he replied, "I can, because this coffee was made with heart." June said nothing more. She smiled, then turned to walk away. But in that moment, she knew. Harlan had found the peace he'd been searching for. And this place, Bramblewood, was now a place of restoration, a place of redemption, a place that had grown into a legacy where every person, employee or guest, felt proud to belong. The new wooden wall still caught the light each day, A quiet symbol of change that didn't need shouting, didn't need slamming fists. Just one meaningful action, to count every name and to see every hand. And in the end, everything changed. Not because of a title, not because of some grand gesture, but because one person had the courage to listen and the courage to act. You may never know how big of a difference you've made, simply because you chose to be kind. If this story brought you a little warmth, if it helped you believe in fairness and goodness again, leave a comment and share how it made you feel. Together, we can help kindness spread just a little further. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we tell a story that might just make you cry or smile with hope. We can't change the whole world, but we can change the way we see one another.